Of Thursday, February 25th, 1993, 50-year-old veterinarian Dr. Joe Wellnitz and his 39-year-old wife, Beth, were closing up their veterinary clinic in Columbia, Kentucky. Joe and Beth walked outside of the clinic and said goodbye to a couple of young employees who were on their way out and heading to their cars. And then, after turning around and making sure no one else was inside the building, Beth pulled a key out of her pocket and she locked the door. Joe was tall with gray hair, and he wore glasses with large lenses. Beth had short light hair, and she almost always had a smile on her face. It was cold outside, right around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, so just about freezing, and the winter wind made it feel even colder. But luckily, Joe and Beth only had a quick walk from their clinic to their house. Years earlier, they had bought acres of land in the small rural town of Columbia, a place where everybody knew everybody, and people went out of their way to look out for their neighbors. And when Joe and Beth had bought the property, they converted an old barn on the land into their vet clinic, and it was right next door to their large 2-story red brick farmhouse. And in the time since they'd opened that clinic, Joe and Beth had become a beloved part of their small rural community. Beth managed the veterinary business, and Joe treated people's pets and farm and ranch animals from all around the area. But it wasn't just the love and care they put into their work that had made them such an important part of Columbia. Joe and Beth were both religious, and they believed the most important teaching of their faith was that people should always take care of others who needed their help. And so the more successful Joe and Beth became, the more they gave back. They donated to charities, they volunteered their time, and they would often just sit and talk to their clients about things that had nothing to do with their clients' animals. So Joe and Beth's veterinary clinic had become more than just a place where people got their pets looked after. It had become a place where people felt like they were treated like family. Outside the clinic, Beth took Joe's hand and they walked across the yard to the front of their house. They had been married for 13 years, but they still held hands and looked at each other like they did when they were newlyweds. Joe and Beth walked past the driveway on the way to their front door. And when they did, Beth glanced over at the 2 Ford Mustangs that were parked there. The cars belonged to Joe and Beth's children, Meg and Dennis. Meg was about to turn 19, and she was off studying at a community college in Lexington, Kentucky, about 2 hours away, and she'd left her car behind when she moved. Dennis was 20, and he was going to classes at a nearby community college and working in Columbia. So if his car was there, Beth figured he was probably watching movies or playing video games in his bedroom. Beth opened the front door of the house, and then she and Joe walked inside. The big farmhouse was drafty in winter, but it still felt warm and welcoming. Beth headed to the kitchen, and Joe went to the family room and sat down on the couch. Then Joe heard footsteps on the stairs, and he turned to see his son, Dennis, coming into the room. Dennis and his younger sister, Meg, were actually Beth's children from a previous marriage. But when Beth had met and married Joe, the kids had loved him almost immediately. And when they had gotten a little older, Joe had adopted them, and they had taken his last name. And Dennis had even changed his middle name to Joe to honor the man who had raised him. Joe and Dennis talked a little about Dennis's schoolwork and his plans for the weekend, and then Dennis headed back upstairs to his bedroom, and Joe turned on the TV. And while Joe watched TV in the family room, Beth grabbed the phone that hung on the wall above the kitchen counter, and she called her daughter, Meg. Meg answered in a cheery voice that was a lot like her mom's, and then Beth asked her how school was going. Meg said classes were going great, and she had recently been studying really hard for a test, so she was going to reward herself by playing cards that night with her new boyfriend, Randy Appleton, and another couple she'd met at school. Beth said that sounded great, but in truth, she was not a big fan of Meg's boyfriend, Randy. Beth had only met him briefly when Meg had brought him to the house, but there was something about him that Beth just didn't like. Beth felt like Randy was lazy and that he didn't have any goals, and she didn't want that to rub off on her daughter. Still, Beth was happy that Meg had made close friends in Lexington. Meg loved reading, role-playing games, and playing cards. And so back in Columbia, it had not always been easy for Meg to find people who shared her interests, and so having friends was always a challenge for her. So Beth decided to keep her thoughts to herself about Randy, and she told Meg that she was so happy she was having such a great time at school. Then Beth told her that her new contact lenses had arrived at the house, and she asked if she needed to mail them to her. But Meg said don't worry about it, she was going to get a ride home that weekend and she would pick up her contacts then, and that way it would also allow her to spend some time with her family. Beth told Meg that Dennis would be really happy to hear that because he missed having his little sister around. Then Beth said goodnight to her daughter, hung up the phone, walked into the family room, and sat down on the couch with Joe. She told him that Meg was coming home that weekend, and Joe lit up. He was happy Meg was making her own way in Lexington, but he was happiest when the family was all together. Then, a little later that night, Joe, Beth, and Dennis ate dinner. And sitting at the kitchen table, Joe just kept smiling, because he got to wake up in the morning and take care of animals, which he had loved doing since he was young, and then that weekend, he would get to relax with his wife, his son, and his daughter by his side. A little before 4 a.m. the following morning, so February 26, 1993, Joe stepped out of the downstairs bathroom onto the cold hardwood floors. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a white t-shirt. The house was dark, but Joe could find his way to his and Beth's bedroom without any light. So Joe walked down the hallway as slowly and quietly as he could, being careful not to make any noise that would wake up Beth or Dennis. But when Joe walked by the family room, he thought he heard something, so he froze and then squinted his eyes and tried to see into the darkness of the family room, but it was no use. He couldn't see anything. Then Joe heard the floor creak, and he thought he saw someone moving towards him, so he called out to see who was there. In the main bedroom down the hall, Beth suddenly woke up, startled. She thought she'd just heard Joe shouting, but for all she knew, she might have just been having a dream. But Beth looked over in the bed and saw that Joe wasn't there. And so Beth rubbed her eyes and kind of shook the sleep off. She sat up in her bed and she looked around, and her eyes hadn't adjusted yet, so the room was just totally dark and out of focus. And then she stood up and began walking towards the door to see if Joe was maybe out in the hall or something. And as she was reaching for the door, she heard something outside in the hall moving around. And then before she could actually open the door burst open, and Beth just stood there in total shock. And then, as she realized what was standing in front of her, she screamed. Just before 8 a.m., so about 4 hours after Beth had seen something in her bedroom, Beth and Joe's 2 younger employees that they had walked out of the clinic with the night before arrived at the veterinary clinic. The young man and woman said good morning to each other and walked to the door, and then when they got there, the man took a set of keys out of his pocket, he unlocked the door, and they both stepped inside. Beth and Joe rarely locked the door to their house, but they always locked up the clinic, because they had other people's personal information on file inside. The clinic was dark, so the young woman flipped on the lights, and both employees started getting the clinic ready for the day. But then, the man stopped in his tracks and just stared at the wall. The woman asked him what was going on, but he just leaned in closer to the wall, and his eyes went wide. He couldn't believe it, but he was sure he was staring at a bullet hole in the wall. He showed it to the young woman, and she started to panic. Then she looked at her watch, and she saw that it was already several minutes after 8 a.m., and Beth and Joe were almost always at the clinic by 8 a.m. So the 2 young employees ran out of the clinic and crossed the yard to the main house. The door was unlocked, so they walked right inside and began calling out for Beth and Joe, but nobody answered. So the young woman ran upstairs while the young man made his way across the first floor. And almost at the same time, the 2 employees started screaming. Then the young woman came flying down the stairs, she ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Officer Jeff Hancock of the Kentucky State Police slammed his foot on the gas pedal in his cruiser and sped down a country road in Columbia. He whipped past farm and ranch land on either side. Then he peeled off the main road and followed a small winding road for a few more miles until he finally arrived at the Wellnitz property. Hancock parked his cruiser in the driveway behind the 2 Ford Mustangs, and he stepped outside. Right away, he saw Joe and Beth's 2 young employees just standing out front, looking totally dazed. Hancock was in his early 30s with short brown hair and broad shoulders, and he spoke with a strong southern accent. It was still cold outside, but Hancock couldn't feel it. His heart was pounding, and he felt sweat on his forehead. He had grown up not far from where he was standing, and he had known the Wellnitz family for years, and he could not believe the call that had just come into the station. Hancock took a deep breath, and as he did, he heard all the other state police cruisers that were rushing in this direction. And just a couple of seconds later, those cars were arriving at the property and officers were streaming out of their vehicles. Some stayed back with Joe and Beth's employees outside to figure out what they knew, and others began going into the house to make sure it was safe. Hancock took a deep breath and then followed the group of officers into the main house. Once he was inside, he made his way down the hall, but when he got near the family room, he stopped cold. He looked down at the floor, and he felt like he'd gotten the wind knocked out of him. On the floor, just a few feet away from him, was the body of Joe Wellnitz, and Joe's white t-shirt was stained with blood. Hancock knew Joe well, and he admired how much Joe gave back to the community and how Joe always tried his best to help others whenever he could. And Hancock could just not imagine how anybody could have done this to such a good man. But Hancock told himself that he had to put his personal feelings aside for the time being and just do his job. So he moved away from Joe's broken body and walked down the hall towards the main bedroom. He saw the door was cracked open, and through the crack he could see something on the floor inside the room. So Hancock walked the rest of the way down the hall, he opened the bedroom door and stepped inside, and again he felt like he got the wind knocked out of him. Joe's wife, Beth, was lying dead in her pajamas, face down on the floor in a pool of blood. Hancock could hear his heart pounding in his ears, and none of this made any sense to him. Beth was one of the kindest people he'd ever met, and he wondered how this could even be real. Then he snapped out of it and heard noises coming from upstairs, so he stepped out of the bedroom and called a couple of other officers to where he was. And while those officers stayed with Beth's body, Hancock headed down the hall and walked upstairs. On the second floor, he could hear officers talking in one of the rooms. So Hancock walked down a long hallway towards those voices, and then he stepped into Dennis's bedroom. And then once he was inside, Hancock's shoulders slumped, and he shook his head at what he was seeing. Like his parents, Dennis was dead, face down on the floor. Hancock had known Dennis since Dennis was a kid, and so this was almost too much for Hancock to bear. But he told himself again that he had a job to do, and now that job was going to be investigating the first triple homicide ever reported in Columbia, Kentucky. Hancock left the bedroom and headed downstairs again, where ballistics experts were already hard at work, and they had found multiple 9mm bullet casings near Joe's body. Then Hancock spotted the lead investigator, Detective Roy Wheat of the Kentucky State Police. So Hancock walked over to him to see what Wheat needed him to do. Detective Wheat had been in law enforcement a lot longer than Hancock. In fact, he was getting closer and closer to his retirement. But still, in all his time as a cop, Wheat had never encountered anything like this in such a small, close-knit community. And while ballistics experts did their jobs and other officers searched the house for signs of forced entry, Wheat's thoughts were somewhere else, because he was worried that the Wellnitz family had been targeted, which meant he needed to make sure their daughter, Meg, was alive and safe. The state police were quickly able to locate Meg's address in Lexington. So Detective Wheat contacted the Lexington police and state troopers in the area, and not long after that, Wheat got word from Lexington authorities that Meg had been found safe in her apartment. Officer Hancock breathed a sigh of relief when he heard this news, because just like with Dennis, he'd known Meg since she was a kid. But then, Hancock realized Meg was about to find out what had happened, and his heart broke for her because he didn't know how anybody would ever get over losing their entire family in a single night of violence. Soon after Detective Wheat knew Meg was safe, he sent Hancock and a few other officers outside to canvass the area and to talk to the Wellnitz's closest neighbors. Then, Wheat heard someone call his name from the main bedroom. So he headed that way, and when he stepped inside the room, he just stood there for a second, stunned. By the bed, not far from Beth's body, an officer was holding up an evidence bag that had a book with a strange symbol on its cover. It was a book of the occult. Then another officer walked in, and he said he'd found black candles in a different room. And Detective Wheat didn't want to say it out loud because he knew how fast gossip could spread in a small town like Columbia, but he couldn't help but wonder if he had a ritualistic or even a satanic triple murder on his hands. Hours after they had arrived, Detective Wheat and his investigative team were still searching the Wellnitz house for evidence. They had found bullet casings from a 9mm pistol near all three bodies, but they hadn't found a murder weapon. They also hadn't found any sign of forced entry, but that wasn't surprising because so many people in Columbia didn't lock their doors, including Joe and Beth. The investigators had not found any evidence that the Wellnitz's house had been ransacked either. In fact, several pieces of Beth's expensive jewelry had been found in the house untouched, so Detective Wheat did not think this had been a robbery. All the investigators really had in terms of, who could have been behind this was the Book of the Occult and the Black Candles. And so there was this early kind of running theory that these murders could be connected to Satanists. In the 1980s, in the United States, members of the media and some politicians had fueled rumors that led to thousands of unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritualistic abuse and murder throughout the country. This cultural event would come to be known as the Satanic Panic. And some of that panic kept going into the early 1990s, so law enforcement often wouldn't rule out the possibility of satanic ritual when evidence like a book about the occult was found at a crime scene. Now, Detective Wheat wasn't quick to jump to that conclusion, but he didn't want to ignore any potential leads. So Wheat would have members of his team look into possible occult connections in the area. But while they did that, he wanted to stay focused on more traditional motives as well. And it seemed to him that somebody must have had it out for the entire Wellnitz family. So he knew he had to talk to the only member of the immediate Wellnitz family who had survived, Joe and Beth's daughter, Meg. In early March, about a week after the murders, Detective Wheat headed to Lexington, Kentucky to meet with Meg. No connections to occult groups or Satanists had surfaced, and Wheat believed the book they had found had probably just been used by Dennis or Meg as research for a school paper. But, like Wheat had feared, rumors had already begun to spread in Columbia, and now the whole town was on edge. People were scared that some fringe occult group was stalking their streets and that they could be their next victim. And the fear in town led directly to added pressure on the police to solve the murders quickly and to bring the killer to justice. And so Wheat hoped that Meg could give him some information about her family that would set his investigation on the right path. In Lexington, Wheat followed Meg into a small apartment that belonged to her boyfriend, Randy. She had been staying there most nights since the murders because she didn't want to be alone. Meg was 5 foot 6 inches tall with short dark hair, and she wore jeans and a light sweater over a t-shirt. Other members of the investigation team had already spoken to Meg, but this was Wheat's first chance to meet with her face to face. And when Meg led him into the apartment, Wheat was taken aback by how young she looked. He knew Meg was only about to turn 19, but seeing her in person, it just hit Wheat that this was a child who had just lost everything and whose whole life had been turned upside down. Wheat sat down on a chair inside the living room, and Meg sat across from him on the couch. He thanked her for meeting with him, and then he told her how sorry he was for her loss. Then Wheat asked Meg if she knew of anybody who might have been angry at her parents or her brother, or even at her. Could she think of anyone who might have wanted to take some kind of revenge on her family? But Meg just shook her head and sort of stared off into space. She said everyone in Columbia loved her family, and she couldn't imagine who would want to do something like this. Then, in a soft, calm voice, Wheat asked her if anything out of the ordinary had happened to her on the night before the murders. Had she gotten any strange phone calls or anything like that? Meg thought for a moment and then said, no, the night had been pretty routine. She and Randy had gone to play cards at the apartment of two of their friends, a young married couple named Bill and Regina Meese. She said after a few hours, Randy was tired, so he left, and the card game had kind of ended earlier than any of them had expected. So Meg said that she and Bill Meese, one of the people who owned this apartment, went to a diner to grab coffee and to study a little for an upcoming test that they had in a class they were both taking at the community college. And then after that, she said she went to her apartment and went to bed. Detective Wheat thanked Meg again for talking to him, and he said several members of his team back in Columbia knew her family well, and they would find the person who had done this and make sure they paid for their crimes. Then Wheat headed back to Columbia and met with other members of the team, and he told them that even though he had not said anything to Meg at the time, something about her story had really jumped out at him. Her boyfriend, Randy, had left their card game early on his own, and Meg hadn't seen him for the rest of the night. But that week, just as Detective Wheat was shifting his focus to Randy, he got a call from Beth's mother. And she asked if police had found a small firebox, which is a type of safe, inside of Beth and Joe's closet. She hadn't thought about it in the aftermath of her daughter's murder, but she had recently remembered the safe and thought police should know about it. Wheat said they had not found a safe of any kind on the premises, and he thanked her for the information and said police would look into it immediately. And when officers returned to the scene of the crime to look for this firebox, they discovered these light markings on the carpet that was inside of Beth and Joe's closet. Marks that definitely could have been made by a small safe that had been sitting there for a long time that was no longer there. Police had ruled out a robbery at the Wellnitz house, but now all of a sudden, with this firebox missing, things had changed, and this totally looked like a robbery. And when Wheat and other members of the state police started delving into the Wellnitz's financial records, they would make a discovery that stunned them and that would send the investigation in an entirely new direction. In the spring of 1993, about a month after the murders, Officer Hancock stood in Detective Wheat's office with a look of shock on his face. After police had discovered that a small safe had gone missing from Joe and Beth's house, they had started looking into the Wellnitz's financial records, and they found someone who stood to inherit $250,000 from a life insurance policy if Joe died. That person was Eric Wellnitz, a third child of Joe's who nobody at the state police had even known existed. Hancock told Wheat that in all the time he had known Joe and Beth, they had never mentioned this third child, Eric Wellnitz. But now Eric shot to the top of Wheat's suspect list. It turned out Eric was the son of Joe's previous wife, and so like Dennis and Meg, Joe had adopted Eric when he married the boy's mother. But unlike Dennis and Meg, Eric did not feel any love for his adoptive father. Wheat tracked down the 19-year-old Eric at an apartment in Lexington where he had been staying with a friend. And when they sat down at the kitchen table, Wheat didn't waste any time. He wanted to know how Eric felt about Joe. And Eric didn't hold back. He said when Joe had left him and his mother to go be with Beth and her kids, he was angry. And not long after that, Eric felt like he had been completely replaced by Dennis and Meg in his adopted father's eyes. And so Eric had decided to cut Joe completely out of his life. And he told Wheat that he hadn't seen or talked to Joe in years. Then Wheat leaned in a bit and asked Eric where he had been on the night of the murders. And Eric said he'd been in Lexington with friends. Wheat nodded, took a brief pause, and then looked Eric right in the eyes and asked him how he felt about inheriting $250,000 from Joe. And immediately a confused look came across Eric's face, and he asked what Wheat meant. And Wheat told him police had learned that Joe left $250,000 to Eric through a life insurance policy. Eric stared at Wheat. Then he asked if Wheat was telling the truth. Had Joe really left him all that money? Wheat said yes, and Eric just looked stunned. He said he thought Joe had totally forgotten about him once he had his other two kids, and he was surprised Joe had left anything at all for him. Wheat would talk a little bit longer with Eric, and then afterwards, he would walk back outside to his car and head back to Columbia. And he wasn't going to cross Eric off his suspect list, but he did think Eric's reaction to hearing about the money was one of the most genuine responses of shock he'd ever seen. So as Wheat made the drive back to Columbia, he thought about other potential suspects, and one person in particular kept coming to mind: Meg's boyfriend, Randy. Randy had left that card game early, hours before the murders, and Wheat knew Meg had taken Randy to her parents' house before, so he might have seen the safe inside of their closet. Also, in recent weeks, Wheat had learned from some of Beth's friends that Beth didn't really like Randy. And now, Wheat thought that, maybe Randy knew that Beth didn't like him, and maybe Randy had gotten mad about it. In late spring of 1993, a couple of months after the murders, Detective Wheat and other members of the investigative team led Randy through the basement of the Lexington Police Department and into a small interrogation room. Randy sat down at a table, and Wheat sat across from him. The interrogation room was bright and cramped like a lot of rooms of that kind, but something about it being in the basement made the room feel even more claustrophobic to Randy, and so he started fidgeting and moving back and forth in his chair right away. In Wheat's mind, Randy made perfect sense as a suspect, but Randy was still a young man in his early 20s, and Wheat wasn't going to essentially end a young man's life based on a hunch. So Wheat remained calm and clear when he spoke to Randy, and he gave Randy every chance to tell his side of things. Wheat started by asking Randy to talk him through the events of the night when he and Meg had gone to play cards with their friends Bill and Regina. And Randy explained it a lot like Meg had. He said they had a good time, but he was feeling tired, so he had left early and gone back to his apartment. Then Wheat asked if anybody could vouch for him actually going home after he left the card game. And Randy began to shift in his seat a bit more. He squinted his eyes like he was trying to remember something, and then he said he was pretty sure he had called a friend from his apartment that night. Wheat thought Randy looked nervous, but that wasn't uncommon in interrogations. Also, Wheat knew some people could remember everything they had done months ago, and others could barely remember what they had done the day before. So Randy not having a totally clear picture of what he did that night didn't mean he was guilty. But there was another angle Wheat wanted to play because he knew something else about Randy. So Wheat leaned forward and asked Randy what kind of guns Randy owned. And Randy sat back in his chair and a look of surprise came across his face, like he had not been expecting that question at all. But Randy recovered and then told Wheat he did own a handgun and that he just liked to go to the shooting range to practice with it. Wheat's face didn't change and his voice stayed totally calm, and he asked Randy if he knew that Beth had not liked the fact that he was dating her daughter. And Randy looked confused again. He said Beth had been really nice to him when he met her at the house, and that Meg hadn't said anything about her mom not liking him. Then Randy said he was trying to help, and he understood that being at home by himself when the murders took place was not a great explanation, but it really was the truth. Wheat and Randy would speak a bit longer. Then Wheat told Randy he was free to go, but that he shouldn't leave town. And after Randy left, Wheat still believed there was a real possibility that Randy was the killer they were looking for. And so not long after talking to Randy, Wheat reached out to Meg and Randy's friends, Bill and Regina Meese, and they quickly volunteered to come talk to Wheat in the Lexington police station. Bill was a big presence. He was 6 foot tall and almost 250 pounds, and he talked and smiled a lot. Regina was much quieter, and she seemed nervous from the moment they arrived. But Wheat assured her that police were just following up on a few leads, and they only wanted some basic information. Bill and Regina told Wheat that they had been married for almost 2 years and they had a baby, and Bill said he was going to community college to get more of an education, and he said he'd met Randy and Meg at school, and they had all quickly become friends. Then Wheat asked about the night of the card game, and Bill told the same story that Meg and Randy had told. And so Wheat figured he wasn't going to get any new information. But when Wheat asked if they were sure Randy had gone home that night, Regina sat up and looked like she was about to say something, but then she cut herself off. Wheat got an excited look in his eyes and he leaned forward and said, "Regina, do you have any more information you want to add?" But Regina ultimately just sat back and shook her head and said nope, there wasn't anything else she wanted to say. So ultimately, Wheat let Bill and Regina go, but Wheat was convinced Regina had wanted to tell him something and had just stopped herself. But when police followed up with Regina and Bill weeks later, the couple did not come forward with any more new information. Weeks after talking to Bill and Regina, investigators were desperate to find something that would break this case open, but it was like evidence of any kind had just dried up. The missing safe and the murder weapons still had not been found. Eric Wellnitz, Joe's third child, had several people corroborate the fact that he was in Lexington at the time of the murders. And even though Wheat still saw Randy as a primary suspect, there was nothing tying him directly to the scene of the crime. And so a case that Kentucky State Police and everyone in Columbia hoped would be solved quickly went cold. The investigation would kind of limp forward, but months would go by with no new leads, and then months dragged out into years, and almost everyone connected to the case just began to move on with their lives. Meg would go on to finish school, and she and Randy would get married, and then they would get divorced. Regina and Bill would have 2 more kids together, and Detective Wheat would retire from law enforcement. But even as the Wellnitz murders faded from the spotlight, Officer Hancock, who had known the family, refused to let the case go. He said he owed it to Joe, Beth, and Dennis to see their murders solved. And he found support from the new lead investigator who had been assigned to the case after Wheat's retirement. And together, they did keep the case open and they kept searching for any new evidence that might lead them to the killer, but it was very slow going and every possible lead turned into a dead end. And after a while, the Wellnitz's friends and family pretty much gave up on ever finding justice for the 3 people they had loved dearly. But fast forward to October of 2002, almost 10 years after the murders. Officer Hancock sat at his desk going over the facts of the Wellnitz case like he had done regularly for almost a decade. He just wanted to see if their investigation had missed something. And this time, as he went over all the facts of the case, Hancock did find a new piece of information. And that information led investigators to interview someone they had not spoken to in years. And by the end of that interview, Kentucky State Police would finally learn who had killed the Wellnitz family and how they had done it. Based on information from that interview in 2002, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the morning someone murdered Joe, Beth, and Dennis, February 26, 1993. On that day, just before 4 a.m., the killer parked their car in the driveway in front of the Wellnitz house. Then the killer stepped out of the car, closed the door, and felt the cold wind whip across their face. The killer was wearing all black. The killer scanned the area, and everything was quiet. And this is exactly why they had chosen the early morning to carry out this plan. They wanted to take out the family when everyone in town was asleep. The killer took a breath, drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband, walked up to the front door of the house, and went inside. It was dark, but the killer had been to the house before, so they knew where they were going. And they walked down a hall towards the main bedroom on the first floor, but when the killer passed by the family room, they heard footsteps. Then they saw someone moving. It was Joe. And Joe had heard something himself, and so he called out, and the killer, in response, raised their gun and fired. But the bullet went way off course. It did not hit Joe. It shot through the side door of the house, and it hit a wall of the clinic next door. Near the family room, Joe screamed and began rushing towards the sound of the gunfire, knowing there was an attacker in the house, but the killer was able to steady themselves and fire off multiple shots into Joe, dropping him right onto the ground. Joe had thrown the killer's plan off, but, acting on instinct, the killer just forgot about Joe and rushed down the hall towards the main bedroom. There, they threw open the door and stepped inside, and there was just enough light coming from the window for the killer to see Beth standing right there in front of them. The killer raised their gun, Beth screamed, but before she could move, the killer fired, and it hit Beth right in the chest. Beth staggered and blood covered her pajamas, and then the killer squeezed the trigger again, and the bullet hit Beth in the forehead. Beth fell to the ground and died in a pool of blood. Once Beth was down, the killer turned and ran back down the hall and up the stairs to Dennis's room on the second floor. The killer opened Dennis's door and saw Dennis getting out of bed, so the killer shouted for Dennis to get on the ground. Dennis was so confused and scared, and he didn't know what was happening, but he laid on the floor face down while the killer kept shouting at him. Then the killer reloaded their weapon, walked across the room, stood over Dennis, and shot him multiple times in the back. The killer waited to make sure Dennis was dead, and then afterward, they ran downstairs to make sure Joe was dead, and then after that, they ran back to the main bedroom, where they checked to make sure Beth was dead. And then, inside of that main bedroom where Beth was, the killer crossed the room to the closet. They opened the closet door and found the small fire safe in the corner. They grabbed the safe, which was lighter than they thought it would be. Then they walked downstairs with it and headed outside. The killer got to their car, opened the back driver's side door, slid the safe into the back seat, shut the door, and then climbed into the driver's seat. Then the killer turned to the passenger seat and smiled. And their accomplice, who was sitting in the passenger seat, smiled back, leaned across the seat, and gave the killer a kiss. Then the killer stripped out of their black clothes, and the accomplice grabbed a trash bag from the floorboard, and the killer tossed their clothes and the murder weapon into the trash bag. Then they started the car, and the two drove away from the house and out of town. Once Columbia was far behind them, the killer pulled into the dark parking lot of a fast food restaurant. They drove around to the back and stopped the car. Then the accomplice got out of the car, walked to a dumpster, and tossed the trash bag into it, and then got back into the killer's car. A little later, the killer dropped off the accomplice at an apartment. But before the accomplice stepped out of the car, they kissed the killer again and told the killer not to wake up the baby when they got home. Then the accomplice smiled, stepped out of the car, and headed into the apartment. And as they walked towards the bathroom to take a shower, they passed by a photo of their mom, dad, and brother. And the accomplice told herself that at least she had not been the one to actually pull the trigger. Meg Wellnitz had arranged the murder of her parents and her brother, and she had gotten Bill Meese to carry out the actual killing. It would turn out that Bill and his wife Regina, the two that had hosted that card game for Meg and Randy, had an open marriage. And Bill had been in a sexual relationship with both Meg and her boyfriend Randy at the time of the murders. And when Meg would lie in bed with Bill, she would tell him that she needed to get rid of her family. Because, unlike Joe's third son, Eric, Meg knew she would inherit hundreds of thousands of dollars and all of the properties and land her parents owned if her family died. And Meg wanted to be rich and independent. And she wanted to be free to have a relationship with Randy or Bill or both of them whenever she wanted and however she wanted. And she didn't believe her religious parents would ever approve of that kind of relationship. So Meg had told Bill that she would give him a cut of her inheritance and a cabin that stood on the land her family owned if he killed her family for her. And Bill agreed to do it. And so Meg had taken Bill to the house a week before the murders when her family was out, so he could see where the safe was in the closet, and also so he could get a clear layout of the floor plan. Then, after the murders, Bill had told his wife, Regina, everything, and she had remained silent for years. But in 2002, almost a decade after the murders, the new information that Officer Hancock had discovered was that Regina and Bill had gotten a divorce. And Hancock knew that Detective Wheat had always believed Regina knew more than she had been willing to say. And Hancock hoped maybe Bill had been the one keeping her quiet. So Hancock and other members of the state police interviewed the newly divorced Regina, and it turned out Hancock was right. With Bill out of her life, Regina was willing to tell them everything. Regina gave police a detailed account of Meg and Bill's murder plot. Then she said when she had moved away from Bill, she had kept the safe that Bill had stolen and held onto all those years, and she handed that safe over to the authorities. There was nothing of any value in the safe when the authorities opened it up, and so we have no idea if at some point there was lots of valuable things in here that were taken out of it after the murders, or if this safe was always empty. We just don't know. But with this safe in their possession, and with all of the new evidence Regina had provided them, police were able to get Meg and Bill to confess to their roles in the murders. Bill Meese, who was in prison for another crime at the time of his murder trial, was given the death penalty. And as of the summer of 2023, he is still on death row. As for Meg Wellnitz, she was sentenced to life in prison with a chance of parole in 25 years. But in 2014, Meg was found dead in her prison cell from an apparent suicide. She was 39 years old, the same age her mother had been when Meg arranged Beth, Joe, and Dennis's murders. On June 29, 2003, a 14-year-old boy named John and his best friend, a 16-year-old named Mark, were walking in this back alleyway behind a row of shops in Manchester, England. Mark had asked John to go back there, to which John was a little bit confused because it was just a dead end back there. But he went back there anyways because he figured, Mark must have a reason. And so they're walking along this alleyway when Mark suddenly comes to a stop. Then he turns to face John, and John's looking at him inquisitively, and Mark just reaches out and grabs him by the shoulder before pulling out a huge knife and drives it into his stomach and says, "I'm sorry, bro." Pulls it out again, drives it into his chest before releasing it and letting John fall to the ground. As soon as John hits the ground, he looks up at Mark and he says, "You're killing me." And Mark says, "I had to do it. If you knew all the details, you would understand." And so after only a couple of minutes, John goes quiet and he's laying still on the ground, and Mark would stand there just waiting for about 20 minutes to ensure that John really was dead before calling authorities and claiming some madman had snuck up behind them and attacked his best friend, and you gotta send an ambulance as fast as you can. When the ambulance arrived, to Mark's horror, they were able to keep John alive, and they were able to get him to a hospital where he nearly died twice on the operating table, but he ultimately would make a full recovery. And when John was well enough to speak, he would tell police that Mark is the guy who attacked him, but he had no idea why. When Mark was confronted with these allegations that he was the one who attacked John, he quickly confessed. And the police thought, this is a strange case, but pretty open and shut, and they arrested Mark for attempted murder. When investigators began digging into the motive behind this attack, they, along with Mark, were not prepared for the totally bizarre story that unraveled. The judge in this case would say well-schooled fiction writers could not come up with the plot of this real-life story. And so this crazy story starts 4 months before the stabbing in February of 2003. In February of 2003, Mark was a 16-year-old student who was also a part-time dishwasher at a restaurant near his home in Manchester, England. Mark had okay grades, but even by his own account, he was nowhere near an academic. In fact, he was quite dim-witted. He was very close with his family, who all lived in a very modest home in a very modest neighborhood. By all accounts, Mark was living a very ordinary life. That year, Mark discovered an online chat room for teens in Manchester, England, and it was designed to, make friends and talk about fashion and sports. And initially, when he logged into this chat room, he was just watching. He wasn't really participating. But over time, he became a very active user and in fact became totally obsessed with this chat room and basically put everything else in his life on the back burner to the point where his grades were tanking and he was staying up all night. This really took over his life. Also in February of 2013, John was a 14-year-old student who lived in Manchester, England, but not near Mark, and at this point he had not met Mark yet. He was incredibly intelligent and polite and charming, and he was an excellent, excellent student, and he went to a very, very prestigious school. But while John's academic life was going really well, his home life was kind of in shambles. His mother had a series of really crappy boyfriends that always left, and they always left her feeling very depressed. And it was just a very sad environment around his mother. And John, unfortunately, had grown up believing one of his mother's ex-boyfriends was his biological father. And even though this boyfriend had abandoned the family, John at least knew who his dad was. But it would turn out his biological father had actually abandoned him when he was a brand new baby, and he had no way of figuring out who his dad even was. John really wanted to escape his home life. He wanted to just live somewhere else, have an adventurous, happy life away from all the sadness and depression he was around all the time. And so it was in that frame of mind that he discovered this chat room, the same one that Mark had discovered. Although they don't know each other yet, they're both entering the same chat room. John's initial interest in this chat room was not nearly as high as Mark's was. Mark pretty much immediately became obsessed with being in this chat room. John was a little bit more reserved, but his mom purchased a laptop for him, which suddenly gave him 24/7 access to this chat room, and he found himself going on there all the time, to the point where he was staying up all night and even skipping meals just so he wouldn't have to leave his screen even for a few minutes. The main focus of this chat room was supposed to be sports and movies and entertainment, but the real reason teenagers were flocking into this particular chat room was to flirt with each other. And Mark and John were no different. They both really enjoyed, these flirtatious interactions they were having with different girls on this chat room. But John's interactions with the girls was very friendly and wasn't going to go anywhere. It was not really intended to. Whereas Mark fell head over heels in love with the girl he was flirting with, and her name was Rachel. Rachel was a 16-year-old living in Manchester, England, who worked at a gym. And when Mark saw her pictures, he was just totally smitten with her, and he sent her a direct message, not really expecting her to write back. But she did, and she seemed at least somewhat interested in him. And that night, they stayed up all night chatting with each other, and Mark is just over the moon. For the next couple of days, Mark and Rachel were talking nonstop on this chat room. And then at some point, Rachel says, "Hey, I really want to introduce you to this guy I met on this chat. He reminds me a lot of you. I think you guys would get along great. His name is John." And Mark was like, "Okay, cool." So Rachel introduced him to John, and they hit it off right away. And the three of them formed their own separate chat thread outside of the main chat room. And very quickly, through this separate chat thread that they were on pretty much 24/7, Mark and John would become best friends, and Mark and Rachel would fall deeper and deeper in love with each other. Every time John and Mark were in this chat room, they would use a web camera, but Rachel didn't have one. And initially that really frustrated Mark because he wanted to see his girlfriend in real time, but she said she didn't have the money to get one. And then she said she was shy. And so Mark's getting frustrated, but she says, "Mark, come visit me. You don't live that far away. You can see me in real life in real time." And so initially Mark's excited, and he's talking to John about how excited he is to go see his girlfriend, but then he gets cold feet and he makes an excuse and he doesn't go. Rachel's disappointed, but she asks him again a couple more times if he'll come visit her, and every time he would agree, and then he would kind of chicken out. But after the last time he canceled on her, he finally got the courage up, and he invited her to come visit him. And this is when she started getting cold feet. And they kind of went back and forth until they basically stopped asking to visit each other, and they just decided that their relationship was going to live online, even if there wasn't a web camera involved. About 3 months after Rachel, Mark, and John had started their own separate chat thread, a new user popped up inside the main chat room. It was a fairly controlled group, so it was pretty easy to tell when there were new people added. And this individual only wrote in pink text. So he stood out, his name was Kevin, and he told the group that he was a stalker and that he had a foot fetish. And the group thought this guy was pretty weird, but they figured it was just, some kid trying to get attention. They didn't think much of him. But shortly after Kevin's arrival, Mark would get a private message from Kevin that said, "I know you're Rachel's boyfriend and I'm her stalker and I'm going to hurt her." Mark didn't know what to do, so he just went to Rachel and he said, "Hey, I got this strange email from this guy named Kevin who says he's going to hurt you and he's your stalker." And Rachel kind of made light of it and said, "Oh, just ignore that guy. I don't know what that's about." And John didn't know what to make about it either, so Mark just kind of ignored it. And then the next day when Mark logged into the chat room, Rachel wasn't there. Now, Rachel always logged in at the same time that Mark did and that John did. It was very rare that she wouldn't be there. And so Mark asked John, "Have you talked to Rachel today?" And John said no. And then Mark went into the main chat room and he asked some people in there if they had seen Rachel or talked to her, and they said no. And that's when Mark went into his email and he had another message from Kevin. This message, again, was about Rachel, but this time Kevin is saying he actually has Rachel hostage. And the only way he's going to release her is if Mark lets Kevin look at his feet, because again, he has that foot fetish. And so Mark, interestingly, does not go to the police. He doesn't tell anyone about this. He just says, "Okay, I'll do that." And so he lets him see his feet. And then Kevin writes back saying, "Okay, I've released Rachel." Later that day, Rachel came back online and she thanked Mark for what he did, but she felt really bad that he had to be kind of humiliated in that way. And she said, "You know what? We really need to meet up. We need to see each other face to face. I want to apologize to you and give you a hug." And so they decide the next day they're going to meet up finally in town together. But the next day when Mark went to the rendezvous point, Rachel didn't show. In fact, after this missed meeting, Rachel never contacted Mark again. She just vanished. When Mark got back to his computer, he asked John, "Have you talked to Rachel?" And he said no. And again, he went into the main chat room and he asked around and no one had heard from Rachel. And then a couple of days later, after just continued silence from Rachel, and Mark's really upset about this, he notices a rumor being passed around in the main chat room about how apparently one of the members of this chat room abducted and killed another member of the chat room. And Mark's thinking to himself, no way, that can't be about Rachel. But almost immediately after this rumor was kind of announced on the main chat, people started chiming in that they think it could be Kevin, the guy who writes in all pink, the guy who claims he's a stalker, and this girl Rachel, because they had both logged out around the same time and had not logged back in again. They were the only ones in this chat room that were that inactive. And then after that, dozens more users were commenting that this was actually true, that Kevin had indeed abducted Rachel and killed her. They'd heard about it in other chat rooms and at school, and all of a sudden, Mark's reality is just coming crashing down. And he feels so guilty that he probably could have done something to stop this, and he didn't. But then interestingly, even though Mark was devastated, just crushed by what has happened, he just continued to log into the chat room and acted like nothing had happened. And John picked up on this strange behavior and began kind of delicately asking him, are you doing okay? But Mark made it clear he did not want to talk about it. And over time, the rumor about what happened to Rachel and Kevin just kind of left the chat room, and it just seemed like people moved on, including Mark and including John. Over the next month, John and Mark's relationship really strengthened. They continued to speak in that private chat, now missing Rachel, so they were only interacting with each other in there, and they even began meeting up in person and hanging out in real life. About a month after Rachel's disappearance, a new person popped up in the main chat. It was a woman. Her name was Janet, and she wrote in all capitals, and she reached out to Mark. And she said to Mark that she was a mother of two, she was married, she was 44 years old, she was a real estate agent, but secretly, she was a spy for the British Secret Service. And in fact, she was the third most powerful person in all of Britain, and she was contacting Mark because she was sent to recruit him. She told Mark if he agreed to work with her, not only would he become an agent like her, he would become fabulously wealthy, and he could be her boyfriend. Now, of course, to an adult, this sounds preposterous and sounds like an obvious scam. But you gotta remember, Mark at this time was extremely vulnerable. He's just lost his girlfriend under very suspicious circumstances, but no matter how it happened, she's gone and he's still grieving her loss privately. And he's just not a very bright person, so he's kind of primed to be taken advantage of. And she was promising him all the things he wanted in life: status, money, romance. And so even though he didn't necessarily believe everything Janet was saying, he wanted to believe her, and so he went along with it. He did not tell John about his interactions with Janet, perhaps signaling that he didn't fully believe it and was maybe embarrassed to give away details, but we don't know. As soon as Mark told Janet he was prepared to work with her, she made him swear an oath through the chat and then told him he would need to go to London for initiation, where he'd be meeting the Queen, amongst other dignitaries and officials. At this point, Mark asked a couple of qualifying questions, namely, how would I explain to my mom that I was just going to suddenly leave for a couple of days in the middle of the week and miss school? I have to give her a reason for that. And she would say, your mother will be looped in on this process. In fact, once you go to London for initiation, we'll be in touch with her, giving her progress reports on how you're doing, and you'll have 2 opportunities every day to call her. Feeling satisfied that this was in fact legitimate, he told Janet, okay, when do you want me to go? And she said, well, there's a caveat. You have to pass a series of tests before you're going to be allowed to go to initiation. This is where Janet explained to Mark why he specifically was being recruited. She said his friend, John, was actually not named John. His real name was James Bell, and he was a very, very important person. But she couldn't say why until he passed his first test. And so Mark's very confused by this, and he says, okay, well, what's the first test? And she says, well, you need to demonstrate you can protect your friend, James Bell. And so I want you to escort him from his school to his dentist appointment tomorrow. You're going to be his bodyguard for 1 day, but you can't let him know you're his bodyguard. He can't know that you know his real identity. So if you can do that successfully, when you get back, I will explain to you why he is so important. At this point, Mark is very committed to this, so he says, yep, I'll do it. He reaches out to John that day and he says, hey, can we hang out tomorrow? And John tells him, yeah, but I have a dentist appointment right after school, so maybe after that. And Mark says, oh, don't worry, I'll tag along for your dentist appointment. And John's like, great, I could use the company. So the next day, Mark meets up with John, aka James Bell, and he walks with him from his school to his dentist appointment, and he doesn't notice anything suspicious, so he doesn't need to do any bodyguarding duties. And after the dentist appointment, the 2 of them just go to a mall and they spend the rest of the day together. Once Mark got back to his house and opened his computer, there was a message waiting for him from Janet. And the message said, we had agents following you and you did a great job. You passed your first test. Now I can tell you why James Bell, your friend John, is so very important. And she told him that at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is this big safe that only a couple of countries know about. And inside of that safe is 568 billion pounds. And it belongs to the Queen. But only one person has access to that safe. And that person is James Bell. Literally, his body would need to be in front of the safe for its special scanner to scan him, recognize it as James Bell, and then it would open its door. Despite its implausibility, Mark believed this was real. Not so much because he naturally believed the safe at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean was real, but it was because he totally believed Janet was real. Janet had the ability to know what he was wearing, where he had gone that day, what he was up to. I mean, she seemed to know everything about him. And it's because she told him she has agents monitoring him all the time, disguised as bus drivers and teachers and mailmen, that basically he was under constant surveillance. And she explained to him that that's what happens when you're being recruited. We have agents watch you. So when Janet gave Mark his final test, despite how shocked Mark was at what he had to do, he was willing to do it because he really believed he was doing it for the government. The test was simple. Mark needed to kill John, aka James Bell. And she explained to him that James Bell actually had an inoperable brain tumor and he was going to die any day. And if the wrong country found out about this, they could steal his body after he died and they could use his body to gain access to this safe. And so we need to preemptively end his life, take control of his body, and get that safe open. She told Mark if he completed this test, he would move on to the initiation phase in London where he would meet the Queen and he would get his first paycheck of 80 million pounds and he would officially become Janet's boyfriend. Mark is in so deep at this point, he is fully committed and he says, yes, I'm prepared to do this. And she says, okay, your new name is Agent 47695 and you need to go buy a large knife. She said there was going to be an abort code for this test, which was going to be 6969. And if at any point he hears anybody say that to him on the day he's supposed to carry out this attack, that means it's off and do not do it. So on June 29th, 2003, around 11 a.m., Mark and John, aka Agent 47695, and James Bell met at a bus station in Manchester. Mark took John down the alleyway that Janet had instructed him to go down to commit the stabbing, and she had assured him she would be one of the first people to arrive on scene. She would be dressed as a detective, and she would ensure he did not get arrested. And so once he was in position, Mark turned around, grabbed John by the shoulder, pulled out his knife, said he loved him, and then began stabbing him. When the police arrived, Janet was not there, and Mark, after giving his statement about what happened, was asking the police officers, when's Janet going to be here? And no one knew what he was talking about. After John survived the attack and said Mark was the one who attacked him, Mark would tell police, you gotta find Janet. She's the one who can explain what's going on here. But Janet never arrived because Janet didn't exist. Neither did Rachel. Neither did Kevin. Neither did James Bell. Neither did 189 other accounts that Mark interacted with on a daily basis inside of that chat room. And all of those fake accounts were determined to be controlled by one person, and that one person was John. When John was confronted with all these confiscated chat logs that clearly showed he was behind all of these accounts, he confessed. John said he never entered this chat room in order to do any of the things he did or, to manipulate Mark. He said when he joined, he just saw a picture of Mark and was kind of in love with him and wanted to get closer to him but didn't know how. So he created Rachel in order to get closer to Mark, but then became jealous of Mark's love of Rachel. So he killed off Rachel using Kevin, and he didn't expect Mark to believe it. He thought he would pick up that this is all made up when he's involving this stalker that's abducting and killing Rachel. But when he saw Mark totally believed it, John realized, wow, Mark's pretty gullible. I wonder what else I can get him to believe. And before long, he created Janet, who had complete control over Mark. And originally, John was using Janet to make Mark spend more time with John. He was going to be the bodyguard of James Bell, which was really John. When John started to feel guilty about what he was doing to Mark, he realized there was no good way out of this without kind of exposing himself and definitely losing his friendship to Mark, something that in a weird way he really, really cherished. And so he decided that the only way to end this was for him to die. And that's when he had Janet flip the script from protect James Bell to kill James Bell. And even on the day where he was going to get attacked, he had given that abort code. So maybe some part of him thought, I don't necessarily want to go through with this. But he never used the abort code. He was literally prepared to die to protect that relationship with Mark. Mark might have had suspicions that something was up with Janet or even Kevin or Rachel, but he never suspected John was behind any of these accounts. He learned about this betrayal when they were in court, and John is confessing once again to being behind all of these people that Mark had been interacting with. Apparently in court, when Mark is hearing this for the first time, he was just standing there, mouth open, just completely dumbfounded that he's hearing this. And then he would say afterwards, I've been such a fool. Mark was convicted of attempted murder, but he only spent 8 months in jail, and then he was given a 2-month probationary period where during that time, he could only go on the internet with supervision, and he wasn't allowed to enter into any chat rooms. John was convicted of inciting his own murder, which no one else has ever been charged with, so this is a first. And he was not given any jail time, but he was given 3 years of probation, where in that time, he was not allowed to use the internet without supervision, and he also was not allowed to enter into any chat rooms. And both boys were told they had a permanent restraining order on the other. So for the rest of their lives, they will never interact. Today's podcast is sponsored by the online therapy platform BetterHelp. Stress can rear its ugly head in all types of ways. Maybe work has you anxious about deadlines, or maybe you're worried that the college fund you've been investing in for years is actually not going to be enough for your kids. And maybe you don't even know you're stressed. In fact, many people don't always recognize the physical symptoms of stress, things like headaches, teeth grinding, and even digestive problems. But nowadays, no one has the time to go to the doctor's office and fill out all that paperwork and then wait around for the doctor to finally come out to help you deal with your stress. But that doesn't mean you need to let your mental health suffer. Now, you can get the professional help you need from the comfort of your own home, and that's with BetterHelp. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and financial aid is available to those who need it. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, making it super easy and free to change therapists if needed. In today's world that's telling you to do more, sleep less, and grind all the time, here's your reminder to take care of yourself, do less, and maybe try some therapy. So, give it a try and see if online therapy can help lower your stress. MrBallen listeners can get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallenPod. That's BETTERHELP.com/MrBallenPod. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Old Man's Secret. On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them, and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before her disappearance. After the parents left the police station, the police began conducting interviews with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said, absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well liked and respected in town, and Rose Marie had gotten married very young at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the kids. By all accounts, from the outside looking in, they were a very ordinary family. But as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history, they discovered there were some big problems behind closed doors. Despite his friendly, outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by, and neither the police nor her family heard anything from Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event broke her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, but after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say he didn't know anything, but it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life. Why wouldn't he want to give it to us? And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decide to get the police involved. There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl, Elizabeth. The police asked Joseph, "What's going on here?" And he tells them that earlier that day, he had opened his front door of his house, and lying on his front step was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, "This girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick, and I can't take care of her. Can you and Mom take her to the hospital?" While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, "We need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life." And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like she could easily be in her 60s. Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, "Do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively?" And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in 2 separate rooms to be interviewed. They first interviewed Elizabeth, and initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. And for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again." When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, "Okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened." After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands, she took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only one door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for Elizabeth. To get into this shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot-tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, he could open that secret door and it would reveal this secret underground prison that was basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through the secret door and actually entered into this prison, you would start by entering this soundproof narrow hallway that went on for several feet before it entered into this very small bathroom area where the bathroom was unbelievably cramped and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow. And at the end of that hallway, it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small that it barely contained the one bed that was inside of it. And then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick reinforced concrete. That, combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison, meant no one could hear Elizabeth's cries for help. Also, the inside of the prison was heavily monitored by Joseph's security system. So truly, Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy. She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone. Her only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child. She was terrified of the pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing. And so he gave her a book about childbirth, and he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and he said, "Good luck." And so on August 30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the birth of Kirsten, Elizabeth would deliver 6 more of her father's children, all the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms. And after the baby died, Joseph just took the body, threw it in a stove, and incinerated it like it was nothing. In the late 90s, the 6 living children down in the basement were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement, and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply for multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to. And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home, he put on this elaborate charade about how he had discovered this baby on the front step and that there was a note attached to the baby and it was from Elizabeth, their missing daughter, and this child was apparently Elizabeth's and she couldn't take care of it and she was leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their own. And Joseph had actually made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it. Over the next several years, Joseph would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these kids in and she and Joseph raised them as their own. Eventually, when these 3 kids got old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth, was a lowlife and she had abandoned them and she didn't care about them, when in reality, their mother and their other 3 siblings they didn't know existed were locked up in the basement below their feet. Initially, investigators believed all of these children Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got out of the prison, no man would want her. She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they would get to experience it for real. Finally, in 2008, so 24 years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police found out about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs and they used the codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those 2 kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other 3 siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D you primarily get from the sun, and in her 19 years of life, she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know what was going on in her basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemary, and they investigated her and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared. It's also worth noting that in those 24 years that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the basement, Joseph had over 100 people rent out a room inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. However, one tenant who was there for a 4-year stretch had a dog with him the whole time, and every night the dog at some point would suddenly stand up, its ears would prick up, and it would start growling like it heard or it saw something. And at first, this tenant would try to see what the dog had seen or heard, but after never seeing anything, he would always just dismiss the dog when it did this at night. Later on, when that tenant figured out what was actually happening inside the house while he was there, he realized his dog was most likely hearing the faint sounds of the family that was imprisoned right below him. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However, anonymous sources have come forward and said the family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives. As for Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most hated people in his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And so now prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed. And so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement.
He will be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old.